In 1902, on a forgotten stretch of coastline where the tide ruled everything, a 70-year-old fisherman named Elias Morrow realized he had miscalculated by minutes, just minutes. By the time he turned back toward the narrow path that connected the abandoned fishing village to the mainland, the water had already swallowed it whole. He stood there with the cold surf pushing steadily inland, the sky sinking into a bruised blue, and the wooden cabins creaking in the wind like old ship hulls. He had crossed that place hundreds of times in his youth. It used to be alive, nets drying on lines, smoke rising from chimneys, the clatter of boats against rocks. Now it was nothing but crooked roofs, broken trapdoors, and rusted lantern hooks that swayed without warning. Elias wasn't frightened at first. He had survived storms that had sunk younger men. He knew how to wait, he knew how to listen, and he knew how to stay still when the night wanted to test him. But as the darkness pooled between the shacks, something shifted. Not the tide, not the wind, something heavier. The sound came once, thump, slow and deliberate, like weight dragging across old planks. Then again, closer. Wood strained. A crate toppled somewhere behind the smokehouse. Elias froze. He knew that sound from a different chapter of his life, from the hills where he hunted for food during lean winters. Slow breathing, low grunts, the scraping of hooves against damp soil. Something big was moving between the cabins, and the tide wouldn't recede for hours. He tightened the straps of his coat and stepped back toward the largest shack, the only one with a door that still closed. Whatever was out there had noticed him. He felt it in the way the night suddenly held its breath. Before I continue, tell me from which city you're watching and what time it is there now. I always like to know how far these stories travel. Elias Morrow had spent most of his life on the water, not chasing glory, not chasing records, just working, surviving, doing what every coastal man of his generation did. He was the kind of fisherman who knew the tides by smell, who could tell a storm was coming by the way the gulls disappeared, who trusted the sea even when it punished him. At 70 years old, he still woke before dawn out of habit, still tied knots without looking, still felt most at peace when the world was quiet and the land was far behind him. But time changes the coast, and time changes the man. The abandoned fishing village had once been a place where Elias delivered nets and shared meals with families who had long since moved inland. The sea took its boats, the storms took its roofs, and the decades took whatever warmth it had left. Now it was little more than a handful of leaning shacks, broken piers, and stories trapped in rotting wood. That afternoon, Elias had walked there for one simple reason: solitude. He wanted to breathe the salt air without hearing anyone call his name. He wanted to sit on a crate and listen to the tide rise. A man who has lived long learns to appreciate silence in ways younger men don't understand. He had checked the tide schedule. He had checked it twice. But tide tables don't warn you about strong winds inland. They don't warn you when the moon pulls harder than expected. They don't tell you when a man's memory is off by 10 minutes. By the time Elias realized the water was already climbing the rocks, it was too late. The path back home was gone, swallowed under churning grey surf. A night stranded wasn't new to him. He had endured far worse. What he hadn't expected was the sound, deep, heavy, deliberate, coming from between the cabins as darkness fell. Elias Morrow didn't panic when the tide cut him off. Panic was for younger men who still believed they could outrun the sea. At 70, he understood a different truth. Sometimes the ocean chooses the schedule, and all you can do is adapt. The abandoned fishing village had a few structures still standing, barely, but enough to shelter him until morning if he used them wisely. He stepped onto the warped planks of the old main pier, testing each board with the firmness of someone who'd lived his life around rot and salt. The wood groaned like a living thing. Every sound carried far in the emptiness. The wind pushed through the cracks between cabins, low and hollow, like breath moving through a flute with missing holes. He scanned the shoreline. Grey water surged where the path home had once been. No chance of wading through now. Not unless he wanted to be thrown against rocks by waves that looked slow but hit like a mule. No, he'd stay the night, eat a little dried cod from his satchel. Keep moving to stay warm, simple. Then he froze. A plank somewhere behind the smokehouse flexed with weight, heavy weight. He listened, not with fear, but with the kind of focused stillness that only decades on the water teach you. Seagulls were gone. Wind was steady. The tide hissed and lapped. But from the inland side of the cabins, something shifted. A dull thump, then another. Elias turned slowly, eyes narrowing. He had heard animals in abandoned places before. Dogs, raccoons, occasionally a coyote in winter. But this was heavier, too steady to be a stray dog, too dense to be something small, something pushing through debris with the confidence of a creature that didn't expect competition. He stepped back toward the largest shack, the net shed. It had once stored lobster traps, ropes, and barrels. The door still hung on its hinges. If it still closed, even loosely, it would give him something between himself and whatever was out there. Before reaching it, Elias bent down, picked up a fist-sized stone and tested its weight in his palm. Too light to do real damage, but enough to buy a second or two if thrown at the right moment. He slipped inside the net shed, careful not to scrape the doorway. Dust floated in pale beams of light that slipped through slats in the walls. Most of the old traps had collapsed into tangled skeletons of wire. Ropes had stiffened with salt and time, but the space was dry and the air was warmer than outside. He closed the door softly. The hinges whined, a soft, complaining cry. He winced. Then he heard it. Breathing. Slow. Heavy. Wet. Not human. It came from somewhere to his left, outside the net shed, the kind of breathing that rose from deep in the chest of an animal with real mass. Elias held his own breath, listening for rhythm, distance, direction. There. Another grunt. Not aggressive, but exploratory. Snout investigating the ground. Hooves shifting against damp planks. A low scrape of something pushing aside a bucket. Boar, Elias whispered to himself, barely audible. A big one. He had hunted boar when he was much younger, back when lean winters forced men to earn every meal with sweat and danger. Boars were unpredictable, fast, strong enough to break a man's ribs with one charge, and here in the narrow maze of cabins and debris, he'd be at a disadvantage. The breathing shifted again, closer this time. Elias moved deeper into the net shed, scanning for anything he could use as a tool or a weapon. Most of the old gear was useless, rusted hooks, warped boards, decayed nets, but behind a broken crate, he noticed a gaff hook sticking out of a pile of rope. The wooden handle was swollen from moisture. The metal was dull but intact. He gripped it, testing its balance, not ideal, but better than a stone. Outside, the creature snorted, a deep, guttural burst of air that shook dust from the rafters above him. The boar was right outside the door now, maybe inches away, separated only by a thin sheet of weakened wood. Elias stepped back, keeping the gaff raised but angled low. If the animal charged, it would break through the door easily, but he'd have half a second to strike. Another grunt, this one shorter, curious. Then silence. Elias hated silence more than sound. Silence meant the animal was thinking, deciding. He waited. And then, thunk. Something heavy rubbed against the outside of the door, snout or shoulder. The wood flexed inward slightly. Elias's heart finally thumped hard enough to feel. Not fear, not yet. Something sharper. Calculation. If the boar came through, this shack became a trap. He needed a way out. Now. He scanned the back wall and spotted what he needed, a small square window frame with half the boards missing. Too narrow to climb through quickly, but not impossible. He moved toward it quietly, testing the height. He could get through, but it would take time. Time he might not have. Outside, the boar exhaled sharply, an irritated snort. Then he heard hooves shifting, slow, heavy, pacing. The animal was circling the shack. Elias tightened his grip on the gaff, feeling the old instincts stir, the same instincts that had kept him alive in storms, wrecks, and winters, when the ocean tried to take more than it gave back. He backed toward the window, lowering himself carefully. One leg over, then the other. He twisted his torso, gripping the edges. Halfway through, he heard it. A crash. The boar had slammed the side of the shack, testing it. Dust rained from the beams. Something cracked. Elias pushed harder, forcing his shoulder through the frame. His coat caught on a nail, tearing fabric. He didn't stop. He pulled until he felt the nail rip free or the cloth surrender. He didn't know which. He dropped outside the back of the net shed, landing hard on cold sand and scattered shells. Pain shot up his knee. He gritted his teeth, rolled onto his hands and pushed himself up. Inside the shack, hooves scraped against wood. The animal was inside now. Elias limped backward, moving toward the row of cabins closest to the shoreline. The moon had risen higher, casting long shadows between the buildings. Every shadow looked deeper than before. The boar let out a loud, echoing grunt from inside the net shed, angry now, confused, searching. Elias steadied his breathing and tightened his grip on the gaff hook. This wasn't about waiting anymore. This night was going to be long, and he wasn't the only thing trapped here until the tide returned. Elias kept low as he moved between the cabins, his boots sliding over wet sand and broken shells. The cold bit into his joints, slowing him more than he cared to admit. Behind him, from inside the net shed, the boar huffed and scraped at the floorboards, its hooves clicking sharply as it turned in tight, frustrated circles. He had dealt with animals like this before. A boar didn't stop once it fixated on something. It tested, it pushed, it waited for weakness. He couldn't let it corner him again. Ahead stood the row of fishermen shacks, each leaning at a different angle, patched with mismatched boards, roofs sagging like old backs under years of salt wind. Most had no doors left. Some had holes where windows once were, but one still had a reinforced frame made from old ship timbers, a cabin built by a man who had known storms well. Elias had eaten meals in that very house decades ago. He hurried toward it, keeping his weight low and his steps controlled. The moonlight spilled between buildings, casting long streaks across the sand. Every shadow felt like a place an animal could lunge from. His hand tightened around the gaff hook until his knuckles went white. A sudden grunt echoed behind him. Elias whipped his head around. The boar had pushed its way out of the net shed, through the wall, not the door. A panel of rotted wood hung from its tusk, like a broken jawbone. The beast shook it free with a violent toss of its head, then stood still, steam rising from its snout in the cold air. Its eyes caught the moonlight, dark, unblinking, assessing. It saw him. Elias didn't run. Running from a boar invited disaster. Instead, he walked backwards slowly, keeping his shoulders angled, avoiding the sudden, sharp movements that triggered charges. The boar snorted, scraped its hoof against the sand, and began to pace. "Easy now," Elias muttered, as if the beast understood human caution. The boar took a step forward, slow, deliberate, confident. It wasn't starving, but it was territorial. And tonight, Elias was inside its territory. He reached the reinforced cabin and slipped inside, pressing his back to the wall. The air smelled of old nets, stale salt, and a faint hint of smoke that had never quite left the boards. He eased the gaff hook down beside the doorway, then peered out through the broken window frame. The boar stood a few yards away, its head lowered, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air, tracking him. A gust of wind rattled the shack's loose shingles, and the animal jerked its head up, alert and tense. Elias scanned the room for anything useful. A cracked barrel sat in one corner. Rusted hooks hung from the ceiling beams. A coil of old fishing rope lay under a collapsed stool, stiff but intact. He limped over, grabbed it, and tested its strength. Dry, rigid, but not completely worthless. He coiled it over his shoulder, knowing he might need it. Rope could save a man, or stall a beast. He moved to the far wall, running his fingertips along the boards. One felt loose. Behind it, cold air seeped through a seam where the wall met the sandbank. A small escape route. Too small to crawl through fast enough, but big enough to give him an idea. If he could lure the boar to the front of the cabin, he could slip out the back and create distance. He listened again. The village creaked and shifted in the wind. Waves smashed the rocks in slow, steady pulses, and somewhere outside the boar let out a long, guttural grunt. Elias peeked through the window. The animal was gone. His heart thudded once, a heavy, sinking beat. He scanned left, then right. The moonlight carved pale shapes across the sand, but no dark outline of the boar. No shifting shadow, no sound of hooves. The silence pressed in tight. Then, crack. The boards on the side of the cabin flexed inward. The boar had circled. Elias grabbed the gaff hook in one hand and the rope in the other. He stepped away from the wall as the creature rammed it again, harder this time. Dust rained from the ceiling. A board split. A tusk punched through the gap like a blade. The animal snarled, a deep, violent rumble. Elias backed toward the rear seam in the wall. He shoved the loose board outward. Sand trickled through. The gap widened, just enough. He slid one leg through, then the other. The wood scraped his back as he forced himself through the narrow opening. Behind him, the boar slammed the cabin again, shaking the structure. Elias stumbled out onto the cold sand, rolled forward, and scrambled to his feet, gasping from the sudden sprint of effort. Pain shot through his knee again, sharper this time. He steadied himself with the gaff. The boar rammed the wall once more, and the cabin shuddered violently. Elias didn't wait to see if it would break through. He limped as fast as his legs allowed toward the old smokehouse, one of the sturdiest buildings in the village, built from heavy planks and brick supports. If he could reach it, he would at least have one place where the animal couldn't simply burst through the walls. Wind whipped the sand around his boots, stinging his ankles. The moon climbed higher, frost-white and merciless. His breath came out in short clouds. Behind him the boar bellowed, a furious, explosive sound that rolled across the empty shoreline like thunder. Halfway to the smokehouse, Elias slipped. His boots skidded on a patch of slick rock hidden under the sand. He caught himself with the gaff hook, the metal striking the ground with a sharp ring. Pain shot up his wrist. He clenched his jaw and pushed himself upright, glancing over his shoulder. The boar had emerged from the cabin, splintered board stuck to its flank. It shook itself violently, sending debris flying. Then it lowered its head. It was going to charge. Elias braced himself. He raised the gaff hook. "Not tonight," he whispered to the dark. The boar let out a roar, deeper than any he'd heard in years, and lunged. Elias threw himself sideways at the last possible moment. Hooves thundered past him, the boar's massive body brushing his coat as it tore through the sand. It overshot by several feet, before skidding, turning, and snorting with renewed fury. Elias didn't hesitate. He bolted for the smokehouse, ignoring the screaming protest of his knee. He reached the structure, pulled the heavy wooden door and slammed it shut behind him. Darkness swallowed him. Only the sound of his breath and the distant crash of waves filled the small space. Then, thud. The boar slammed the door. The wood held, but for how long? Inside the smokehouse, darkness lay thick and unmoving, like something poured into the room and left to settle. Elias leaned his back against the heavy wooden door, breathing hard, his heartbeat pulsing like a slow drum in his ears. The air smelled of char, old salt, and the faint, sour ghost of fish long dried and carried away. He ran his fingers along the wall until he felt a support beam, solid, cold, reassuring. Outside, the boar snorted, pacing in tight, angry loops. Hooves scraped the sand. Occasionally it rammed the door with its shoulder, sending vibrations through the frame and rattling the loose hinges. But the smokehouse had been built to withstand storms. It was the safest structure in the entire village. Safest didn't mean safe. Elias lowered himself to the ground, gritting his teeth as his knee stiffened. He flexed his fingers slowly, trying to coax warmth back into them. The cold was settling in. Winter cold. The kind that crawls under clothes and takes its time choosing where to bite next. He fumbled for the dried cod in his satchel and tore off a small piece. More habit than hunger. He closed his eyes and listened. The boar huffed, circulated, stopped, then sniffed near the door again. It was waiting, not leaving, not losing interest. Elias knew the kind of animal he was dealing with. This wasn't a curious intruder. This was a territorial boar, likely an elder one, large enough to dominate this stretch of land. It had claimed the abandoned village long before Elias stepped into its domain, and now, with the tide sealing them both inside, the creature saw him as the only variable to remove. He rubbed the side of his leg, feeling the stiffening joint beneath layers of fabric. A long night, he had thought earlier. Now he knew the measure of it. He turned his focus inward, towards survival, towards strategy. Sitting here passively until dawn was a gamble he couldn't trust. The boar wasn't behaving like an animal that would wander off. If anything, it seemed emboldened, energized by the chase. He needed a plan. He rose slowly and let his eyes adjust to the faint shaft of moonlight slipping through a crack near the ceiling. Shapes softened into view, the outline of an old iron smoker, the skeletal frame of a broken table, a bucket overturned in the corner. On the opposite wall, he spotted a narrow loft above the smoker, where fishermen once stored firewood and salted goods. The ladder leading up to it had collapsed, but the support still remained. If the boar managed to break in, and Elias suspected it might, being higher ground could save his life. He moved cautiously toward the smoker, his boots sending small echoes through the hollow room. With both hands, he tested the old structure. The metal groaned under his weight, but held. Outside, the boar rammed the door again, hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Elias flinched and steadied himself. The door held, but the hinges were weakening, even sturdy timber buckles under enough repetitions. He looked up toward the loft. The edge was just high enough that he could reach it with the gaff hook. Using it like a climbing tool was risky. One slip, and he'd fall. But if the boar breached the smokehouse, staying on the floor meant one outcome. He dragged the table frame beneath the loft and lifted the gaff. Hooked it over the beam, tested the hold. Solid enough. He pulled himself up, wincing as his knee protested. He gritted his teeth and used mostly upper body strength to haul himself onto the narrow platform. There he crouched, testing the boards. They creaked but didn't sag. Below him, the room was a cavern of black shapes. Outside, the boar circled again, snorting, its breath audible even through the cracks in the wall. Elias exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. He had elevation. He had a barrier between them. He had a moment to think. He scanned the smokehouse interior from above. Near the far wall, half hidden by shadow, something caught his eye. A long, straight plank leaning behind a pile of debris. He squinted. Not just a plank, an oar. A heavy, water-worn oar from a boat long gone. If he could reach it... He memorized its position and calculated his descent route. Not yet. He'd wait for the moment when the boar forced an opening and distracted itself. Minutes stretched. The beast paced, snorting now in shorter bursts, more agitated than before. It pressed its snout to the base of the door and exhaled sharply. Elias heard the wood fibers complain under persistent pressure. Then silence, the kind of silence that prickled along the spine. Elias strained his ears. No hooves, no breathing. Nothing but the rhythmic crash of distant waves and the soft clatter of loose shingles above. He waited. 1 breath. 2. 3. Crash. The door jolted inward with violent force. The hinges bent with a scream of metal. A second hit followed instantly, faster, more decisive. Elias pressed himself low against the loft as dust filled the air. A third slam, and the hinge snapped. The door swung inward, bouncing off the wall. The boar entered like a storm. It barreled into the smokehouse, snorting wildly, nose down, tusks scraping the floor as it swept for scent. The heavy body moved with brutal efficiency, hooves striking sparks off scattered metal. Elias held his breath. The boar stomped around the room, circling, searching. It stopped beneath the loft as if sniffing upward. Elias shifted his weight silently, careful not to let the loft creak. The boar grunted, frustrated. Then it turned toward the back wall, toward the oar. Elias's pulse quickened. This was the moment. He moved with controlled speed, lowering himself halfway off the loft, one hand gripping the beam, the other clutching the gaff hook. His boots dangled silently above the floor. The boar shoved aside debris, its snout brushing the oar's handle. Elias dropped. He hit the ground with a grunt louder than intended, his knee buckling for an instant, but he forced himself forward, lunging toward the oar. The boar whipped around with shocking speed, releasing a guttural roar that shook the room. Elias grabbed the oar. The boar charged, he swung. The oar cracked across its muzzle. A brutal, resonant thwack filled the smokehouse. The boar recoiled, stunned, but not defeated. Blood trickled from a shallow cut on its snout, glistening in the moonlight. It roared again. Elias backed toward the doorway, toward open ground where he had room to maneuver. The boar dug its hooves into the dirt floor and charged with full force. Elias braced the oar against the ground at an angle, a technique he hadn't used in decades. The boar collided with it. The shockwave tore through Elias's arms, but the oar held, redirecting the beast sideways. It stumbled, crashed into the smoker, and toppled it with a crash that echoed across the village. Elias staggered toward the doorway, breathing in sharp, burning gulps. The boar got up. Blood streaked its flank. Its eyes burned with fury. It charged again. This time, Elias dove sideways out of the smokehouse, rolling onto the sand. Cold grit filled his palms. Moonlight washed the empty village in a pale glow. Behind him, the boar burst out of the doorway, boards splintering around it. Elias rose unsteadily and tightened his grip on the oar. He had one thought. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep hiding, not with his knee failing and the tired hours from retreating. If he was going to see dawn, he needed to turn this village from a trap into a weapon. Elias stood in the open space between the cabins, chest heaving, cold air burning deep into his lungs. The moon had risen high enough to cast a harsh silver wash across the abandoned village, turning broken boards and overturned crates into jagged silhouettes. His breath came out in pale bursts. The oar felt heavy in his hands, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. The last tool between him and a creature built for brute force. The boar stomped in front of the smokehouse, snorting aggressively, tossing its head as if shaking off the blow Elias had landed. Its flanks heaved. Blood darkened one side of its muzzle. The animal was furious now, no longer just territorial. It wanted to finish this. Elias tightened his grip on the oar, adjusting his stance, feet apart, knees slightly bent, careful to compensate for the weakness that kept sharpening in one leg. He felt the throb with every shift of weight, but he ignored it. Fear made men clumsy, pain made men sloppy, but experience let you survive. The boar pawed at the ground. Hooves scraped sand, then it lunged. Elias sidestepped sharply, but his knee gave out for a split second. He stumbled, and the boar's massive body grazed him as it barreled past, the brush of its coarse hair and sheer weight knocking him off balance. He hit the ground hard, sand filling his mouth and nose. His ribs screamed. He rolled desperately as the boar dug in and swung around for another charge. He scrambled to his feet, barely in time. The boar slammed into a cabin wall where he had been lying just moments before. The force shattered part of the wooden frame, boards exploding outward in a rain of splinters. The entire village seemed to vibrate with the impact. Elias staggered backward, oar raised. The boar jerked its head free of the wreckage, snorting, eyes wild. If he kept fighting like this, open, exposed, relying solely on strength, he wouldn't last long. He needed control. He needed angles. He needed to shift the fight into a space where the boar's bulk worked against it. His eyes scanned the area. There, a narrow alley between two cabins, barely wide enough for a man to pass sideways, too tight for a boar to charge full speed. And beyond that, the remnants of the old trap shed, a place filled with nets, ropes, rusty hooks, collapsed lobster pots, tools, obstacles, weapons. Elias backed toward the narrow alley, limping, forcing himself to keep his movements controlled. The boar watched him with rigid attention, snorting thick plumes of vapor into the air. It paced, waiting for a misstep. Then it advanced. Elias slipped into the alley. He pressed himself sideways, wooden boards scraping his coat as he forced his shoulders through. The boar followed but couldn't fit its full width. It rammed the edges, snarling in frustration. Elias inhaled sharply. The alley funneled sound, every grunt, every breath, every scrape, magnified. He kept sliding until he burst out on the other side, into the open space behind the trap shed. The roof had partially collapsed, but three walls still stood, swollen with moisture and sagging like tired shoulders. Nets hung from beams, brittle but intact. Coiled ropes lay like sleeping snakes on the sand. He could work with this. The boar reached the end of the alley, squeezed halfway through, then pushed, hooves digging, muscles trembling. The wood groaned under its force. Elias grabbed one of the nets and tested it. Weak, fragile, but if folded enough times, it could tangle legs or snare tusks. He folded it quickly, doubling and redoubling the mesh. His fingers moved with old memory, tying, pulling, looping. Rope was a language he'd spoken his entire life. Behind him, the boar forced itself out of the alley. It shook off splinters, snorted violently, and advanced. Elias backed toward the trap shed doorway, clutching the folded net in one hand and the oar in the other. The boar lowered its head and charged. This time Elias didn't dodge sideways. He threw the net. The tangled mesh spread in the air like a collapsing sheet, landing across the boar's face and shoulders. The animal roared in shock and fury, thrashing, its hooves slipping in the sand. The net tangled around its tusks. It shook its head fiercely, dragging the net but not entirely shedding it. Elias used the opening. He darted forward, swinging the oar low. The wood cracked against the boar's foreleg. The beast staggered, collapsing sideways for an instant. The village shook with the impact. Elias retreated, breathing hard. The oar vibrated in his grip, numbness spreading through his hands. He had only made the boar angrier. The animal tore the net free, shredded pieces hanging from its tusks. It bellowed, a deep, primal sound that reverberated through Elias's bones. Then it charged again. Elias sprinted toward the trap shed, faster than he thought his body could still move. The boar thundered after him, hooves pounding, snorts echoing. Elias dove into the shed and turned sharply to the right. The boar entered. But the moment it did, its massive body clipped a collapsed beam lying across the threshold. Its forelegs tangled in the wood. The animal stumbled, crashing headfirst into the interior wall with a sickening thud that shook the entire structure. Elias seized the moment. He grabbed one of the old lobster pots, a rusted metal trap shaped like a cage, and swung it with all the strength left in his arms. It crashed onto the boar's skull, bending around the curve of its head. The animal shrieked and thrashed wildly, smashing into walls, sending showers of dust and ancient wood into the air. The trap shed trembled. Elias backed out, chest burning, vision momentarily blurred from effort and pain. The boar fought to free itself, shaking violently, the metal cage scraping against its tusks with loud, desperate shrieks. Elias steadied his breathing. If that shed collapsed with the boar inside, it could end this. He looked up at the roof, sagging, split beams, rotted posts. One good impact would bring it down. He searched the ground and found what he needed, a thick length of driftwood solid enough to act as a lever. He positioned himself against one of the outer support beams, slipped the driftwood beneath it, and pushed with everything he had left. His muscles screamed, his ribs burned, his vision dimmed around the edges. Inside, the boar rampaged, each collision sending deep vibrations through the wall. Elias pushed again. The beam cracked, then split, then gave way. The roof collapsed inward. Sand, wood, ropes, and broken lobster pots rained down in a heavy cascade. The boar shrieked, a guttural, furious roar drowned almost instantly by the avalanche of debris. When the dust settled, the structure sagged into a mound of rubble. Silence followed. A long, trembling silence. Elias dropped the driftwood, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His breath came in ragged waves. His knee throbbed. His ribs protested. His whole body felt twice its age. He stepped back, watching the heap of boards for movement. Nothing, not a grunt, not a breath, not a shift of weight. The village, for the first time that night, was still. Elias limped to a nearby crate and lowered himself onto it, staring at the collapsed shed. Something deep inside him, a place carved over decades by storms, loss, and hard work, felt an old, familiar ache. Survival wasn't triumph, it was cost. Hours remained until dawn. Hours until the tide receded. Elias tightened his coat around his shoulders and leaned forward, elbows on knees. The night wasn't over, but for the moment, the village belonged to him again. For several long minutes, Elias stayed seated on the crate, listening to the fractured rhythm of his own breathing. The cold gnawed through his coat, slipping down his spine and settling between the bones of his back. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the exertion of a fight a man his age had no business surviving. The collapsed trap shed lay in front of him, as a dark mound of broken boards and twisted nets, casting a jagged shadow in the moonlight. He waited for movement, a twitch, a shifting board, anything. But the heap remained still. The bore was done. Not by his strength, by necessity, by the cruel weight of rotten timber and the accidents of an abandoned place. Elias exhaled, a long shaking breath that misted in the cold air. He had lived his entire life near the sea, but never had he felt the night so quiet. The waves still crashed against distant rocks, but even they seemed muted, less the roar of water and more a distant reminder that dawn was still hours away. He needed shelter. Real shelter. That collapse, as fortunate as it had been, had also robbed him of the one structure he'd counted on for refuge. He could not stay out in the open, not with the cold sinking in this deeply. Exposure killed slower than tusks, but more reliably. He forced himself to stand. Pain lit up his knee like a fuse, sending a spike of fire through the joint and up his thigh. He gripped the edge of the crate until the wave of pain peaked and eased. Then he limped forward, scanning the village with the tired precision of someone who knows every movement matters. The reinforced cabin, the one he'd taken shelter in earlier, was still standing, broken in parts, battered by the bore, but standing. And the smokehouse, though breached, had thick walls that might block some of the cold if he piled debris against the openings. But first, he had to be sure the bore was truly finished. He approached the collapsed shed with caution, oar in hand. Each step felt like walking through a memory, the way the sand shifted underfoot like past winters, the wind carrying salt that clung to the back of his throat. The wreckage was a tangle of beams and shattered lobster pots. One tusk protruded from beneath the rubble, a long, curved blade, now motionless. Elias crouched, placing a hand on the debris. Nothing moved. He stayed like that, hand pressed against rough wood, ears open to the night, for a long 10 seconds, long enough to accept truth over fear. "It's over," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was telling himself or the dark. He straightened, leaning on the oar like a cane. The fight had drained him. His legs trembled, his fingers ached, his ribs throbbed with every breath. The cold bit deeper now that adrenaline had faded. The tide wouldn't recede for at least 3 more hours. He needed warmth, needed stillness, needed a place to bring his body back from the edge. He made his way to the reinforced cabin. The door hung loose, crooked from the bore's earlier assaults. Elias pushed it open, its hinge complaining in a long groan. Inside, the air felt slightly warmer, a pocket of stillness sheltered from the wind. He stepped in and settled himself on a section of floor that hadn't yet surrendered to time. He placed the oar beside him, closed his eyes for a moment, listened to the night. His breathing slowed. The village creaked. Waves whispered to the shore. For the first time in hours, the sound didn't carry threat. He leaned back against the wall, letting the timber support his weight. He ran a thumb along the oar's handle, remembering all the years, not glorious years, not heroic years, but steady ones. Years spent on boats that groaned like these cabins, years spent hauling nets with hands that were steadier then than now. His mind drifted, unbidden, to the people who had lived in this place, families who had fished these waters long before he first learned to tie knots. He pictured their faces, blurred by time and the way smoke curled from chimneys in winter. He imagined the laughter of children running between these very shacks. Life, noise, warmth. Now only the sea remembered. A sudden gust rattled the walls, and Elias opened his eyes. He was drifting too close to sleep, and sleep in cold places was a dangerous invitation. He stood again, slowly, and searched the cabin for anything that could help him last the night. In the corner, beneath a collapsed shelf, he found the remains of an old wool blanket, half devoured by moths, stiff from years of damp, but still intact enough to offer warmth. He shook it out, sending a cloud of dust swirling, and wrapped it around his shoulders. The warmth was faint, but it was enough. He sat near the doorway, watching the moonlight spill across the sand outside. The collapsed shed was visible from here, a dark mound in a pale landscape. Beyond it, the shoreline shimmered under the moon, and the distant path home lay hidden beneath black water. 3 hours. He could wait 3 hours. Time stretched. He shifted his weight to ease the ache in his knee. He stretched his fingers to bring life back into them. He closed his mouth over a breath to warm it before exhaling. With each small adjustment, the night grew slightly softer. Eventually, the sounds changed. The waves deepened, a sign the tide was turning. The wind softened. Even the cold seemed to shift, loosening its grip by a fraction. Elias lifted his head. Dawn was coming. It started as the faintest hint of color in the sky, a pale bruising on the far horizon. The moon dimmed as the world lightened. Shadows retreated inch by inch. The collapsed shed became clearer. The cabins took shape. The sea turned from black to steel gray. Then, the path began to reveal itself, first as a darker line beneath shallow water, then as a muddy stretch of stones, then as a narrow corridor where the ocean had relinquished its hold. Elias stood with great effort, leaning heavily on the oar. He stepped out of the cabin, breathing in air that felt a little less sharp, a little more alive. Salt wind brushed against his face. Light pooled across the village. He walked, or rather limped, toward the exposed path. At its edge, he stopped and looked back once more at the abandoned village, at the collapsed shed that had saved him, at the cabins that had shaken with the force of the night, at the empty spaces that once housed lives long gone. He felt a strange pull, gratitude mixed with sorrow. "Thank you," he murmured to the empty place, voice roughened by cold and age, "for holding together just long enough." Then he turned and stepped onto the path. The stones were slick. His knee protested each shift of weight, but he moved with the steady determination of a man who had weathered a lifetime of storms. Behind him, the village remained silent, bathed in early light. Ahead, the mainland waited. He did not look back again. By the time the sun crested the horizon, Elias Morrow was already a distant figure, walking slowly, leaning on an oar, heading home from a night no one would ever believe, and one he would never forget. Morning light followed Elias Morrow long before warmth did. By the time he reached the mainland path, the sun had only begun to lift itself above the horizon, painting the rocks in washed-out gold and leaving the cold untouched. Elias walked slowly, leaning on the oar, each step a reminder of what the night had taken from him, and what it had not. When he finally reached higher ground, he stopped and looked back one last time. From this distance, the abandoned fishing village was nothing more than a cluster of crooked shadows, quiet, harmless, almost small. No one who saw it in daylight would ever imagine what waited there after dark. No one would believe how close a 70-year-old man had come to being claimed by a creature he had once hunted in his youth. He touched the bruise forming along his ribs. Pain answered. But beneath it, something steadier remained. Survival wasn't the loud moment when danger struck. It was the quiet decision to keep moving after it passed. Elias turned toward the coastline, listening to the tide retreat behind him. The sea had trapped him, tested him, and finally released him. It always had its own logic, its own way of deciding who stayed and who went. This time it let him walk away. And as he made the long journey home, Elias carried with him not just the memory of the boar or the collapsing shed, but the reminder that age did not end a man's fight. It simply changed the shape of it. Before you go, what is the hardest night you ever had to get through? Tell me in the comments.